We need media literacy because media are so influential in shaping how we come to see and understand the world. And I think we need specifically critical media literacy because I think the word critical gets to the heart of what's most important about understanding the media environment. A lot of people mistake the word critical to mean just being negative. I've actually had people talk to me about media bashing, and I always try to explain to them, no, it's critical in terms of critical thinking, which means deep investigation and not just being satisfied with what's on the surface. But critical, when it comes to critical media literacy, also attaches itself to a long tradition coming out of critical theory. And for me, that tradition has been starting with Marxism and moving into the things that Antonio Gramsci introduced into the conversation about hegemony and the construction of ideology and things that are actually very unnatural becoming accepted as natural, as just common sense. And then moving into the work of Stuart Hall and others in cultural studies, which played a really important role in explaining how we shouldn't take popular culture for granted. It's not just entertainment, that it plays a real role in shaping our understandings of things like race and class and gender and sexuality, and how all of that plays out in terms of hierarchies, of inequities. And so for me, critical media literacy is really, at the end of the day, always about power. And who has the power in society, who has the power to tell the stories, to shape our understanding of the world. And from there, that actually translates into material power, and that's, so I'm coming from, that cultural studies perspective, that ideological power. Eventually, it's not just about what we think, it's about how we live, it's about distribution of resources, and so critical media literacy it really is a radical tradition, radical, from the original meaning of radical, getting to the roots of what's really happening in our society and the crucial role that media play in maybe not completely determining everything, but in shaping how we come to understand what's going on in politics, what's going on in the economy, what's going on in social upheaval, which, talking to you here in 2023, as always, there are major issues that we're trying to deal with, and media really do play a role in framing how those issues are talked about. Well, it's absolutely essential for any society, but particularly for democratic societies, to have a strong, independent press. That means independent of government control, but it also means independent of corporate control as well. I think that people rightfully have been concerned about government-controlled media as we see in authoritarian nations. But we also should not sort of pat ourselves on the back that we don't have a completely authoritarian government yet, but that corporations play such a powerful role in all the stuff that I talked about a few minutes ago, inequities, distribution of resources. And if media are beholden to corporate interests, how are we ever going to expect them to do the type of investigative work that we want them to do? So I'll just give you an example. Jeff Bezos owns Amazon, which plays a huge role in, in our society and, distribution of all kinds of products now, but also Amazon Web Services and control of the internet. He also owns the Washington Post. And so how much can we really expect the Washington Post to report critically on Jeff Bezos and what's happening at Amazon? To their credit, I think they've tried to do some of that. And I want to be very clear. I think there are really excellent journalists working in for-profit corporate news media who do their best to do the kind of work that they originally set out to do, which is, revealing the truth about what's happening in our society. I do think they do their best, but I think at the end of the day, there's always going to be limits on that as long as media are primarily corporate funded. And you're always going to run up against, sort of at the end of the day, a fence around what can be said and what perspectives can be presented. Years ago, a sociologist named, I think it's Herbert Gans, I'm drawing a blank on his first name, but his last name was Gans, wrote a great book called Fear and Favor in the Newsroom, where he did an ethnography of major news industries and really kind of revealed the limitations and the self-censorship that journalists working for corporate industries often felt like they had to be careful about what they could or couldn't say, who they could or couldn't interview. And so if we are to have a thriving democracy, it really is important that we have a very strong, publicly funded, the money has to come from somewhere. You can't do journalism without a budget. It's going to have to come from somewhere, but when it comes from corporations, when it comes from advertising, that puts too much of a restriction on what could possibly be said. And so we have to have much more publicly funded media infrastructure if we're really going to hope to survive as a democracy in the United States and in other places around the world. This is also true internationally for all societies. And in societies that are captured by authoritarian governments, maybe it's even more important, but also more difficult, because then everything has to happen underground. Well, I think the actual biggest problem, I think, that the United States, where I'm from and what I know most about, faces in terms of elections is that, yes, we are captured by the two-party system. We are captured by the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. It's virtually impossible on a national level to run a third party, fourth party, fifth party campaign. It is more possible on the local level, and I think local politics are really, really important, and they have possibilities that national politics don't have. But we are coming into, the 2024 election, and the vast majority of voters, regardless of their ideology or the affiliation, would not prefer that it's going to be a rematch between Trump and Biden. But it's going to be a rematch between Trump and Biden. It's very obvious that that's what's going to happen now. And, we talk a lot about polarization, that liberals and conservatives have moved farther and farther away from each other. I think there are some concerns about that are real. But what I think is most important is a different kind of polarization, which is polarization between voters and non-voters. And that, if we were to really look at the entire potential voting population, the candidate that wins every time did not vote. Just people who did not vote in the election at all. And it's easy to blame people for that. And to a certain extent, I do think that people need to take responsibility for not checking out of the process. But there's also reasons why that happened. And for a lot of people, going to the polls and having to vote either for Trump or for Biden or for somebody who has absolutely no chance of winning is a real unpalatable proposition to them. And so they stay home. We also have a lot of voter suppression that we could talk about as well. That's a different sort of issue, but I think an important issue. And so the media play an essential role in that as well, because one of the functions of media should be explaining to people why participation in voting, why participation in the electoral process is important, and really getting beyond the spectacle of political advertising and the debates, which are, really nothing more than, like WWE, sort of matches, and really getting into talking about the real issues that people should be thinking about. Climate change, economic inequality, the resurgence of hardcore right-wing racism, misogyny, anti-LGBTQ policies cropping up all over the nation. I mean, these are the really essential issues, and they get so lost in a media system that is focused primarily on profit and what will draw the most eyeballs instead of thinking, critical, engaged minds. Yeah, that's a tough one because it's hard not to fall into despair. I'm pretty convinced that by November, whatever, once the votes are counted, 2024, either Biden will have been reelected or Trump would have been elected again. And, honestly, barring any exceptional circumstances, the outcomes are pretty terrifying. I think there's a good chance that if Biden wins the Electoral College, we'll have a resurgence of everything that we saw in 2020, of refusal to accept, actual election results, leading to political violence. I think the chances of political violence recurring are really quite high. I hate to say that, but I think that's what a rational analysis would suggest. If Trump wins the Electoral College, then we're slated to 4 more years of Trump, which I think any concerned citizen should be very, very worried about. So I wish I could sort of finish our little conversation today on a higher, more optimistic note, but I'm afraid I'd be dishonest if I didn't say that I'm really concerned, and I think we have to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best, and I hope that's not just a platitude.